Perfect. Thanks for that introduction. And thanks to OBSSR for the chance to talk about a good clinical practice e-learning course that's tailored especially for social and behavioral research. This, as you said, Farheen, this talk is part of a launch of the updated course. So this morning, I hope to answer these questions. So first of all, what is good clinical practice? And I'd like to share some history of how the good clinical practice, or GCP, principles developed. How does GCP add value to other existing research standards, like processes we already have in place for human subjects protections? And then why is there a tailored GCP course, especially for social and behavioral clinical research? And finally, how can you access the tailored GCP course? But before I get into all of that, I'd like to acknowledge the wonderful team of people who contributed to the development of the course. The course was funded by a grant from the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences as part of their CTSA program. The grant was to the University of Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research. The PI of the grant is Susan Murphy, and she's joined by a great study team, an advisory board, content consultants in community engagement, GCP and policy, and social and behavioral clinical research. And I also want to give special thanks to the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at NIH for supporting the development and dissemination of the course. And these are just some of the people who have contributed over many years to the development and dissemination of the course. So I'm speaking for this team, and I hope I represent them well. So now let's talk about GCP. What is it? Well, GCP is the latest in a series of international standards for biomedical and clinical research. And this timeline shows some key milestones in the development of ethical and quality standards. Most timelines start with the post-World War II Nuremberg Code that codified 10 principles of ethical research, focusing on voluntary consent and human subjects protections. And then in the 1960s, the World Medical Association published what is known as the Declaration of Helsinki, reinforcing ethical standards for physicians conducting human subjects research. Emphasized principles like respect for the individual, right to self-determination, and right to informed decision-making throughout the course of research. And both of these focused largely on physicians conducting biomedical research. But the U.S. Public Health Service was also thinking about human subjects protections, of course, and instituted a requirement that all clinical research receive ethics review, first in the intramural program, so studies being conducted in Bethesda, and that was in 1953 that came into effect. And then for all federally funded human subjects grants, that was in 1966 that came into effect. And so that was all clinical research, not just physicians conducting biomedical research. Next, the Belmont Report was commissioned after the public disclosure of Tuskegee syphilis study operations and resulted in recommendations to revise the Code of Federal Regulations related to the protection of human subjects. And that report recommended and emphasized three principles: beneficence, respect, and justice. And so whereas the early principles really focused on physicians conducting biomedical research, now we've got an expanded catchment to behavioral and social sciences research. And these are principles that I think we're all familiar with, and we have things in place to make sure that there's some oversight and review of our studies related to those principles. And then finally, in 1990, the original principles of good clinical practice were first proposed by the International Council on Harmonization. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So the full name of the International Council on Harmonization is International Council on Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. And this was a group of regulatory authorities and pharmaceutical industries from the European Union, Japan, and the United States. And of course, in the United States, our regulatory authority is the Food and Drug Administration. So these groups came together, and the original purpose was to create a unified standard to facilitate the mutual acceptance of clinical trial data by the regulatory authorities in those participating jurisdictions. But of course, behavioral and social clinical research doesn't have a regulatory body, and we typically don't interact with FDA. And so our communities weren't so much included in GCP related efforts. Although I do want to mention that NIDA, led by Will Acklin, has done some great work recently to facilitate interactions with FDA, especially around digital therapeutics. And so the more we get into sort of devices and app-based actual therapeutics, we may have more interaction with the FDA, but traditionally we don't. And so our community was not typically included in the GCP discussions. So in addition to the typical ethical standards of the kind of previous principles that we saw, GCP added an emphasis on transparency and quality management and planning and documentation. Okay, so we've talked around GCP. Now, what are they? There are 13 general principles of good clinical practice, but for clarity today, I'm going to talk about 9 of them. And I'll start with these 6 principles, which address concepts that are familiar to researchers working in behavioral and social clinical research already. So research should be ethical. The rights and safety of participants should be respected. Participants should give voluntary informed consent. Projects should have objective review. They should be conducted by qualified individuals, and the trials should be scientifically sound. So none of these are particularly controversial or unfamiliar. And like I said, we have processes in place through our own kind of disciplinary ethical principle, the codes of ethics to ensure these. But there are some principles in the good clinical practice set of principles that may be less familiar or at least a little bit confusing. And I think this is one of them. So clinical trials processes, measures, and approaches should be proportionate to the risk to participants and to the reliability of trial results. So this principle distinguishes two types of risk, safety to participants and reliability of results. And while the behavioral and social sciences community is certainly very familiar with considering safety to participants, my experience is that operational complexity and that sort of threats to the reliability of results are not typically seen or thought of as risks. Since our clinical research often poses minimal risks to participants, it would be easy to conclude that behavioral and social science studies probably don't need extensive oversight, quality management, or planning. But as this principle says, risk is not just about safety, but it's about data integrity and rigor and reproducibility. And so defined this way, behavioral and social studies can be just as complex as drug or device trials, with just as many threats to reproducibility. So what we come up with is this concept of risk-based oversight, with an understanding that risk is not just risk to safety, but also risk to the reliability of trial results. Different institutes refer to that second kind of risk differently. Some people call it risk to rigor, but both are important. Okay, and then principles 8 and 9 here refer to specific aspects of quality management, planning, and documentation. One foundational expectation of GCP is that studies will be guided by a clear, concise, and operationally feasible protocol. And in my experiences working with investigators, I think this may be one of the most valuable additions of GCP to our work, having a solid protocol and supporting quality management plans. Just the process of having to develop a detailed protocol can be useful, clarifying scientific and operational parameters of a study before it even starts. But I think it's reasonable to ask at this point, wait a minute, don't we have study documents like this? For instance, we have a grant application where we describe the study. We have an IRB quote protocol, which is what the document that is typically sent into the IRB for review. And we have a data and safety monitoring plan, all of these documents are required by NIH before a study can move forward. So wouldn't a separate protocol be sort of redundant paperwork? And you can probably tell where I'm going here. I'm going to say usually no. And I would say especially it's perhaps not sufficient operational detail to detect important protocol deviations, but the ones that matter to the science. So before joining the National Institute on Aging, I was a program officer in the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research, and I was managing behavioral and social clinical trials. And NIDCR was one of the first institutes and centers to integrate behavioral and social clinical trials into a system designed around GCP. And so working with my colleague, Michelle Culp, who led those efforts at NIDCR and who taught me about GCP. Thanks, Michelle. We tried to translate the principles so that they were relevant to BSSR clinical trials. And over many years of advising study teams, here are just a few examples of common clarifications that were facilitated by requiring a detailed protocol. And I'll just highlight this last one, this intervention delivery, interventionist training, and fidelity monitoring. This may be especially important to behavioral and social intervention research, where we want to know what the intervention is, how interventionists will be trained and supervised. There's probably not enough detail in those other documents that I mentioned to indicate if these are going well. So I hope I've made a compelling case that the principles of GCP, and not just the ethical ones, but actually the quality management, documentation principles are just as relevant to our community as to drug and device and FDA regulated research. But even if I haven't, NIH has decided they are. They've announced that decision in a series of clinical research policies. And those are summarized in this 2016 article published in JAMA. There are other places to find descriptions of those as well. The green boxes that you see on the bottom are some of the activities that were generated to address some challenges in clinical trials. I'm mostly going to focus on the GCP training policy, but I also just want to highlight that NIH created a protocol template and an e-protocol template tool especially for behavioral and social science clinical research. And that's available on many institute and center and office websites throughout NIH. And so if you need guidance, or if you'd like to give your investigators guidance about how to develop a solid protocol, we have some really good models to offer. But the policy most relevant to my talk this morning is a requirement that all NIH-funded investigators and staff who are involved in the conduct, oversight, or management of clinical trials should be trained in good clinical practice, and they should refresh that at least every 3 years. Those of us who saw this policy sort of developing and who were sort of anticipating the timeline for it, we realized, okay, the behavioral and social sciences research community is going to have to do this too. And so we looked out in the field to see what are the GCP courses that are available. The most common platform for such training is through the CITI platform. And the CITI platform is one that many universities subscribe to so that their faculty and staff have access to all of their catalog. And so CITI had a number of GCP courses that people could take. But if you notice, they're all focused on drugs and devices, drugs and biologics, devices. So while the principles may be the same, the examples and some of the examples were going to be quite different, and they're that they weren't going to be as relevant to our community. NIDA also had developed, the National Institute on Drug Abuse had also developed a good clinical practice course through their clinical trials network. And it did address some behavioral science, but there was still a heavy focus on medications and good clinical practice related to medications there. And so that was good, but maybe not ideal as a solution. So luckily, we discovered that Susan Murphy and her team at the University of Michigan were creating a course specific to social and behavioral research that covered the principles of GCP. And they called it the Social and Behavioral Research Best Practices for Clinical Research course. And so thanks to OBSSR and the Society of Behavioral Medicine, we were able to make that course widely available to the research community. And SBM generously hosted the course on their eLearning platform, free of charge to all, not requiring SBM membership to access it. So, you know, truly a nice collaboration with SBM. For NIH employees, we also integrated the course into our internal learning management system. And then OBSSR worked with extramural institutions, universities, you know, outside NIH, to integrate the new course or this course into their own e-learning platforms. And then not too long after, I think it was kind of cool that Citi adopted the course that Susan Murphy and team had developed, and we're now offering it through their program. So that was the original course, and that was widely available. But in 2020, the Michigan team started planning for a course update. Remember, it needs to be refreshed every 3 years, at least every 3 years. And so we were already getting there for early adopters of the original course. And here's just a summary of the timeline for the development of the updated course that I'm talking about today. And it's ready to access now. So we're we could add a 2024 launched to this arrow. So there's a lot on this slide. It's a summary of some of the course updates that we made from the previous original course. There were lots of them. I'll just highlight some of them that we updated new methods and technologies. So there were references to thumb drives and cassette recorders. And of course, things happen differently in technology now. A section on e-consenting was added. There was a new module on community and stakeholder engagement that was added. And the section on the module on the research protocol was substantially rewritten. So that's just sort of an overview of some of the changes, but there were many. The process for developing and evaluating the updated course is described in this paper here. And the group conducted an initial evaluation of the training. They recruited 99 learners locally at University of Michigan who completed the course, provided feedback on these aspects of the course and other aspects. The scale ranged from 1 to 5, with 5 being best, and you can see that the course was rated pretty highly. And so now we have an updated course specific to behavioral and social clinical research. It's available in multiple ways, in the same ways that the original course was. The Society of Behavioral Medicine is still hosting it on their e-learning platform, and that link is live. So you can take that training today if you want to. The course will be integrated into the NIH learning management system for staff. I think we're still working on that. I think that one is potentially not live yet. And OBSSR has posted all of the materials that an educational institution would need to upload the course to their learning management platforms on the OBSSR website, as well as kind of detailed instructions about how to do that. So here is just a piece of the OBSSR website that describes the course, how to access it, how educational institutions can upload the modules to their own e-learning platforms. So this would be a good place to go to learn about the course. And you can also contact me. I would be happy to guide you to the person or people who could answer questions too. And so with that, I'll stop there and thank you for your attention and time.